So this is chapter 1. What is stress? What is resilience? Now, in terms of physics, stress is the force applied, and strain is the consequence on the system. Now, in terms of biology, stress is anything that disrupts homeostatic balance, homeostasis, the maintenance of a steady state in a biological system. And where this homeostatic balance is affected, the whole system and all its elements, such as blood gas levels, acid-alkaline balance, temperature, etc., they're all held in balance between an upper limit and a lower limit. And if there's a change in that, if there's an alteration in that, we constantly seek to find that balance. Now, limits, these homeostatic limits define our living experience. Outside of those limits, we get sick and we die. Now, technically, the stress response is any psychological and physiological event that occurs in an endeavour to return to homeostasis, the dynamic state, held within these parameters, these limits of well-being. Now, the word stress has become applied to the consequences of stressors on our system. So what we're going to do in this course is simply use that colloquial term, its colloquial usage, because that's what everybody says, all right? So we can say stress is where any demand on the system either exceeds the resources to meet it, or we perceive that it exceeds the resources to meet it. So for example, if you're really tired, you feel like you have less resources. So when we meet a stressor and we feel consciously or unconsciously, or both, that we have enough resources, we have enough time, we've got enough skills, we've got enough energy, we've got enough money, whatever is needed, then the stressor is a challenge. Wow, let's do this. Now, if the stressor feels that it demands more than we have available, we're tired, we've been stressed out, we've been so busy, we go into neuroendocrine stress cascade, which we'll look at later. Now, this is key because this cascade describes a moment of perception that determines a cascade of physiological responses. These distinctions are important, as the perceived stress and the perceived resources may be quite different to what is actually available. Now, in essence, there are 4 kinds of stress. Firstly, there is environmental stress. And environmental stress is things like insufficient nutrition, heading towards starvation. Insufficient water, there's not enough water. Too hot, too cold, and so on. Now, these kind of stresses can be managed to a degree and can yield benefit. And, when we go into cold water, cold immersion, we get hormetic effects. Hormesis is where we grow from dealing with sublethal stressors. But take any of these stresses to extremes, we get systems collapse and death. That's environmental stresses. Second is developmental stress, which we've talked about a little bit in the introduction, in terms of how childhood adversity and both big T and small t trauma set up your HPAA. What's your HPAA? It's your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It's your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The hypothalamus is part of the brain, but the pituitary is part of the brain, and those 2 parts of the brain are responsible for all the hormones and the release of all the hormones in your system. And that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPAA, is set up early in life. Now, it's also about brain myelination in developmental trauma, because the way our brain develops and grows, fatty sheaths are laid down around the nerves, the fast traffic nerves in the brain. And the brain is constantly making connections through experience as we grow as a child. So experience shapes our brain. If there's so much childhood adversity that the hormones that are released into the body are those of adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormones, that changes the way the brain grows. It stops the myelination successfully growing, and it reduces the amount of communication and the networks between different parts of the brain. Literally, it's brain damage. Childhood adversity causes brain damage. Now, when we look at self-applied neuroplasticity, we can look at how we can change that and we can change it. However, if that developmental trauma is such that it affects how the hormones themselves are released in the body, we have an excess of stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, that changes the way the brain can grow. It changes the networks that can be created in the brain. It changes the way the bits of the brain can communicate with each other. Causes lots of problems. Developmental trauma is a kind of brain damage. Cortisol negatively impacts child development. And we can see that early years traumatic events can affect our response to stressors, like we said in the introduction, especially those that act as triggers for a trauma response. So we're going to look at triggers a little bit. Now, the third kind of stress is social and interrelational stress. Of course, this is directly connected to our early years development as well. But so many of us have patterns of emotional and narrative response to complex relational dynamics. When we get into a relational situation with somebody else, we get stressed out with certain things. But what are our unique patterns like? What does your body do when you get in a difficult social dynamic? Maybe if you're out somewhere, or maybe with your family members. What kind of emotional patterns repeat themselves in different relationships? When we get to understand this, we can start to look into this social stress. What kind of narratives do we tell ourselves? Who are you in these narratives? Who are they? What role do they play in your narratives? Do these patterns still serve you? Are these stories true? When did you learn to relate like this? Can you change them to create more optimal responses? Yes. When will you do this? Well, we start now. And the fourth kind of stress, if you think of it like this, is perceptual stress. Now, like I said, this is a powerful recognition, as it means we can do something about it. And this is where breathwork and mind training comes into its own. If a lot of stress is perceptual, and perception is about where we are seeing from and what our attention is focused on, then we can change this. The beauty of this recognition is that as an adult, we can take responsibility for our patterns. When our prefrontal cortex is switched on, we can take responsibility for our patterns and all our responses, regardless of what happened to us. We can begin to find the response ability, the ability to respond, rather than reaction or reflexive. Rather than reactive, rather than reflexive, we can be responsible in our behaviors and our life. You want this? I want this. Now, when you land this, you can truly begin the process of stress liberation, stress emancipation. All these kinds of stress that we've talked about are interrelated. When we understand how we do stress and how do you do stress, then we can begin to reverse engineer it to build resilience. This is your personal resilience project. Now, what is resilience? Let's look at resilience a little bit. Now, it's the capacity to bend like a tree in the wind, we said. The wind makes the tree stronger. Now, resilience is where we ride stress, we surf stress, and we use the experiences to become even stronger, more focused, more committed, more playful, more creative, more curious, more powerful, or whatever resource or skill we need to meet that demand. And we can also have fun doing it. Resilience is not a collapse into an adrenalized reaction, but a switching on of other neurotransmitters. And these other neurotransmitters include epinephrine, adrenaline, but it's balanced with catecholamines, it's balanced with dopamine, it's balanced with endorphins. And we can anticipate beating the challenge. I can do this. It becomes a sport, and we give ourselves rewards on completion. Rewards are so important. Celebration is so important. It's dopamine in the brain. Now, resilience is training our brain so when we fall off the horse, we get back up again. We ride better every time, we ride harder every time, and we have fun doing it. And this is a practice. It takes time. Enjoy it.